Meeting to order. Welcome to the January 17th, 2017 Multidisciplinary Committee Advisory Meeting. We'll take a roll call.
Dr. Klingborg.
Here.
Dr. Druces. Dr. Grant.
Here.
Dr. Pollard.
Here.
Dave Johnson.
Here.
Christy Pulowski.
Here.
Diana Woodward-Hagel.
Here.
Jennifer Laredo. Here. And Dr. Sullivan.
Here. Looks like we've got a quorum, and Dr. Druces will be joining us a little late. The fun of air travel and being diverted to a different airport has him running a little bit behind. Like to give members of the public and the audience an opportunity to introduce themselves. We'll start in the front row and just kind of wind our way back. And it's optional.
I'm Tuesday Kulon from RVP with UC Davis, California, and I'm on the California RVP Association Committee.
My name is Lynn Moon. I'm the president of the California Registered Veterinary Technician Association, and I'm also a shelter technician.
Nancy Ehrlich, CARCA.
Eric Mills with Action for Animals and Welcome.
Leah Schinfeld, CBMA RVT Committee.
Cindy Staley, RVT. I'm here representing Sacramento Valley Vet Tech Association, and I'm also on the CBMA RVT.
Grant Miller, CBMA.
Ken Pulowski, CVMA.
Valerie Fenstermaker, CBMA.
Erica Hughes, State Humane Association of California.
Mark Nunez, Veterinary Medical Board.
Waterhouse Veterinary Medical Board.
And Ms. Rainey, Veterinary Medical Board.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We'll move to item 3 in our agenda, which is the review and approval of the minutes from our October 18, 2016 meeting. Yes.
I have a minor correction. Page 4 of 9, fourth paragraph from the bottom. Dr. Eric Anderson's comment. I don't know whether that's a transcription error or he actually said that, but those drugs are controlled drugs. They're not non-controlled drugs. The xylazine is the only non-controlled drug.
Okay, so there's actually, of the list, we're talking about 2 controlled and 1 non-controlled.
3 controlled. The ketamine component of the premix, the
Yeah.
tinazole, and the diazepam are controlled.
Okay,
That just may be a transcription error.
yeah, okay. We'll take out non.
A reminder to everybody on the panel today, when you're talking, make sure your microphone is on as well. It makes reviewing the video so much more fun when we can hear what you're saying. Other comments? Anything else on the minutes? Members of the audience, any comments, suggestions, corrections, additions, deletions to the minutes? A move to approve?
So moved.
Yes, move to approve as amended. Yeah. Motion in a second. Discussion? Discussion on the motion to move and approve the minutes as amended from the audience? Okay. Vote.
Dr. Klingborg.
Aye.
Dr. Druces. Dr. Grant.
Aye.
Dr. Pollard.
Aye.
Dave Johnson.
Aye.
Christy Pulowski.
Aye.
Diana Woodward-Hagel.
Aye.
Jennifer Laredo.
Aye.
And Dr. Sullivan.
Aye. Great, the motion carries. The minutes are approved as amended. Little housekeeping here with today's agenda. I'm going to move item 8, which is the discussion and consideration of recommendations from State Humane Association of California and the CVMA. We're going to move that up after item 5. So item 8 will now be in between items 5 and 6. Moving on, we are now to item 4, an update from the Complaint Process Audit Subcommittee. And I'll turn this over to our 2 subcommittee members to give us the report.
item 4 there, I have a list of the high points of the expert witness roundtable that Dr. Grant and I attended in November in San Diego. For purposes of this committee, many of the items have already been discussed because they were material that Dr. Grant and I and Diane Woodward-Hagel and I had previously reported on. So unless there are specific questions or items to be discussed in that first page, the one thing I do want to focus on, I thought was incredibly helpful for me, for us, I think for the process, was item 5 on the bottom, where when this group, I should preface, was a group of experts, 5 of them. Most of them were new. The Veterinary Medical Board was represented by Candace Rainey, Executive Officer Anne Marie, the 2 Veterinary Medical Board consultants, and legal Diane Sokolov. So there were stakeholders from all the corners. And when we got to the crux of the discussions, item 5, the table was kind of thrown open, and it was a very informative process for the experts to discuss the what-ifs and what would you do and how do you characterize this with the experts of the experts right there in the room. So I think we moved the ball forward and got some good knowledge transmitted there. But I would like to discuss, unless anybody has any questions about the first 6 items, what is on the second page of the outline. And Dr. Grant will share his thoughts too, but I think we both have, having gone through this process now for a year and a half plus, have kind of come to similar points of view about where we are and where we're going. And maybe I'll stop for a moment and ask Bill if he has some comments.
Well, with regard to the meeting that we had, it was very beneficial to try to put everybody on the same page. I do think that there were, at least at the beginning of the meeting, the experts were clearly not on the same page with regard to some of the issues like negligence, incompetence, things like that. And that really was what needed to happen is to have a frank discussion with, how the reports were being written, how are they looking at an item that would be negligence versus incompetence, and even if you took a group of veterinarians like this, we would be close, but I'm sure that there would be some disagreement as to where we were. So that, I think, was critical. Hopefully that process will continue. I do think that that was just a portion of the experts sharing the information. Jeff and I had a nice conversation prior to this meeting where we have gone through and taken a retrospective look at a number of closed cases, and we have seen certainly a lot of information as we reviewed these cases and made a general term that cases that were closed as recent as maybe 5 years ago seem to be actually quite a difference from things that are closed in the last year or two. And so trying to get everybody on the same page, I think, is really an important thing. That was part of, I think, what we had done years ago when we did the hospital inspection checklist, is putting the inspectors all on the same page and meeting in the same room. So it was a great start. I think it needs to continue. I think it was a learning process for the experts. Quite frankly, it was a learning process for Jeff and I.
Totally agree. And one of the advantages of having been able to see these closed cases which an expert doesn't see, because obviously a closed case, you get everything from the beginning, including the end, and an expert is just, you know, a piece in the puzzle. This flow chart, this algorithm that is the last page of the report, was provided by Candace Rainey. It's a nice, illegible unless you know the process, description of the process, and the expert, you know, clearly is in the middle of it somewhere. But having read the closed cases, it was a very interesting concept to see it from different points of view, to see the process from the respondent, obviously, from the expert's view, from the Deputy Attorney General, and from the board, if you think about what the whole process is intended to do. Protect the pet and owner, yet respect the rights of the veterinarian. And I think, not knowing what it was like 3 years ago, 10 years ago, I have to think it is nevertheless improved now. I get the impression from conversations that the tenor of the board's communication with the licensee is a more educational process rather than a punitive process. And the last thing I'd like to focus on is a topic that's come up over the course of this process for more than once, and that is the concept of having more than one expert witness on a case. And both Diane Woodward-Hagel and Diane Sokolov, obviously being legal-minded individuals, recognize that's a bad idea, but I think they understand better than most of us, certainly non-legal people, why it's a bad idea. And I thought about that a lot. I thought about it during our case reviews. I thought about it during this roundtable. Hopefully, nobody ever has to experience firsthand a hearing, but a hearing is where the two sides get to make their case. There is, by definition, then, two experts on the case. There's an expert for the respondent, and there's an expert for the board. And the person they're making their case to is not a veterinarian. He or she is a lawyer, but he or she is, albeit intelligent, not medically minded. And so the concept is a case has to be made to explain what happened or defend what happened. And if this judge, administrative law judge, hears from two experts, they just have two stories. If they hear from more than two experts, I have to think it must be difficult for them to weigh appropriately whose story they should believe more, just in general. I mean, by the same logic, you could make an analogy that there ought to be two judges. There ought to be one judge for the respondent and one judge for the board, which is ridiculous. It's just not the way the process works. But it was an interesting realization, and the other thing, and I don't know that the other experts in this room would have recognized this because they haven't seen the closed cases that Dr. Grant and I have. So I feel privileged to have done that. But we went around the room and we queried the experts about some things. One of the things I asked was if any of them, at the beginning of the meeting, we all introduced ourselves, of course, if any of them knew what the multidisciplinary advisory committee was, and nobody did. So you all toil in obscurity. But they don't really need to. I mean, this is just kind of a part of the process, and they have their little piece of the pie too. Anyway, I would like to think that we should move forward with some continuation of the review. There are always going to be new people. There are always going to be need for more training and training of old people, frankly. So I would like to think at some level this is kind of just a background part of the board's educational process.
Great, thank you. Bill, do you want to add anything more to the report? Okay. Anne Marie?
Comment I have about the report is the multiple expert witnesses, and I think there's a bit of a confusion about when it is appropriate. So many boards have consultants review cases before they're actually transmitted to the AG's office. So there's a difference between, in-house review and expert review that happens during the case proceeding. And we will always continue to use consultants as that first layer. So we really do use two experts. What we need to discontinue doing is having both of those experts as part of the disciplinary case proceeding, because it really does kind of hinder our ability to move forward with our cases. So it doesn't remove that layer of having the in-house veterinarian review the case, but it does remove both of those expert reports from being part of the disciplinary proceeding. There will only be one expert report as part of the disciplinary proceeding. The first level review really does educate staff as to whether or not there was a standard of care, a deviation of standard of care, or some other form of violation of the Veterinary Practice Act. And we should clearly differentiate cases that have criminal proceedings that may not need an expert versus standard of care cases which do need an expert. So there are some cases that we don't rely on expert witness testimony because the cases are based on facts of criminal convictions. But in cases where we're talking about negligence, incompetence, or some other form of deviation, we will still have two experts' eyes on the cases. But once the case is transmitted to the AG's office, or when we know we're going to transmit the case for formal discipline, we will have one formal expert review and proceed with the case in that fashion, which is consistent with what other boards and bureaus do. And I think, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was kind of a misunderstanding of the use of two experts.
I agree.
Comments from the committee? Comments from the public on that report? All right. I don't know that an action item is required at this point. Okay. Keeping us up to date on what's happening. So that moves us to item number 5. In item number 5, we've got some handouts that should have been on the table back there and been handed out to the committee here. One is a memo from me entitled Discussion and Consideration of Extended Duty Registration for Registered Veterinary Technician Regulations. And then the second is the handout that we received at the last meeting from CARVTA, Suggestions for Extended Functions for RVTs. So you should have those two documents, committee members. And my handout that kind of frames the beginning of this says, as you recall, our previous discussions centered around extended duties for RVTs, and at that time, extended duties, the subcommittee was working on where there might be extended duties within the shelter setting for RVTs, but not necessarily within the regular practice setting. CARVTA submitted a document intended to identify job tasks that veterinary assistants are currently allowed to perform, but that CARVTA suggests should be restricted to RVTs and DVMs within the regular practice setting. So that focus changed from shelter, when we were talking about extended duties, to now regular practice or private practice, however you want to term that setting. Ms. Del Minayo noted that the board and members of the public did not receive an advanced copy of this document, and CARVTA was not being sneaky at all. It just committees meet when they meet, and they put together paperwork, and the document was finished on Thursday, and we met the following Tuesday, and it was just this process. So everybody trying to get information in front of everybody as quickly as possible. And I requested, when we did get a chance to get our eyes on that document, that we simply get a little bit more information to clarify some of these issues and access to care as they are. Really, we found that when we talk about extended duties, need for a particular service and access to care are paramount issues. Well, there were actually 11 things on the list that were pushed forward or proposed by CARVTA, and the Veterinary Medical Board, when I met with them the day after our meeting, lined out 4 of those and chose to give us 7 items: central line placement, invasive procedures, CSF spinal taps, chest tube placement, intraosseous catheter placement, various kinds of centesis, cysto, abdominal, thoraco, and then advanced nerve blocking techniques. And so the last sentence here really is where we are today. I do not think that we're at a point we're ready to discuss each one of these 7 proposed lists of exclusions, if you will, but how do we want to handle this? And just to kind of take one more step back, as incoming CVMA president eons ago, we were getting hit continuously with animal welfare issues. And what we found was that at the board level, the decisions that we made depended entirely upon the people that were sitting at the table. There was, in other words, no consistency, there was no metric or barometer by which we could look at issues and try and figure out some sort of framework how we needed to tackle them. And I think that this is an opportunity for us when we look at these things that have been proposed by CARVTA, for us to have that discussion and figure out what sort of framework do we want to have when we make these types of decisions, rather than, oh, well, we think this today because we've got this group of people sitting at this table. So the discussion here needs to focus more on what our process should be going forward as we look at this, so that we can develop, I think, an effective and coherent outcome product at the end of all of this. And that is, we're generally much better black and white linear thinkers, and now we're going to have to put on our philosopher's hats. So that's where we're at, and I want to open it up for discussion here within the committee, and then we'll also go out to the public and talk about it. Charge. Yes, Bill.
So I think my first question is exactly what was pointed out, is there an access issue and is there a need issue? What's changed in the practice of veterinary medicine that allows or that would require RVTs to perform these other duties in light of those 2 specific issues?
Christine.
Well, I know when we were charged with the extended duties, and I talked to Dave about this, what my first question when somebody would talk about anything was, how did it affect the consumer? And I think because that's what we're charged with. And so we can talk about access and need, we still have to look at what is the effect upon the consumer. So need and access, we have to look and see what is the effect upon the consumer when we look upon these things.
Yeah, David.
Currently there's 5 or 6 restricted RVT tasks, depending on how you want to count them. And as a person who was there when they were originated, there was significant discussion about these tasks in the late 70s, early 80s, that these were tasks that required a higher degree of skill, higher degree of training, and had potential to do harm to the animal if the task was done improperly. And I think that has always been the basis of it. One of my concerns is that with the exception of, I think they modified the relief hole within the last few years, there hasn't been much of a look at this category since its inception. And the safeguard that was put in place originally was that no task could be assigned to an RVT or a veterinary assistant unless the veterinarian dictated that task be performed and that the veterinarian in charge of the case made an assessment of the skills and ability of the individual performing the task. And that has always been the safeguard to the consumer in terms of the task. But let's fast forward. This is 2017 now. We have technologies out there that weren't even there in the 70s and 80s. We have all kinds of new pieces of equipment. Ultrasounds are common, K-lasers are common. There's all types of diagnostic and sample collections taking place. And there might be a place for additional tasks that can potentially do harm. I don't know what those are right now, but I think most certainly we need to take a look at them with a current set of eyes about what is happening in private practice and who is performing those tasks, and is it something that the consumer's aware of, and is there potential for there to be harm to the animals? I also think we need to look at the complaints. Is there a complaint that's come before the board, let's say that 15 cases of some task has caused harm to an animal? And that most certainly is something that we should take a look at. If those 15 cases show that a procedure is being done, then maybe we need to take a look at that procedure and see who should be doing it. So I think this opens up a whole new category that obviously we're not going to look at 7 tasks today and decide, but then I think we need to keep in mind this is a nice list of 7 things to look at, but are there 7 more? And are there 7 more after that? And then after this starts to be a discussion, someone thinks, oh, well, I'll think of this task we need to take a look at. So this may become very open-ended. And again, the bottom line is we have to look at the veterinarian's involvement and assessment. We have to look at the risk to the consumer and protection of that animal, and be careful that we're not creating job security.
Jennifer.
Dave stated what I was going to say, is it was brought to my attention at the last meeting that the 2036, the RVT tasks were created in the 70s, quite frankly, before I was even born, so I'm not completely and they seem extremely outdated, not that I'm outdated. But I know that this is being broached as an exclusions for veterinary assistants. I'm thinking it needs to be a inclusion to 2036, the RVT job tasks. And I know that is it a need or an access issue, but the animals that are being operated on are the consumers also, and we do need to protect them. And I happen to be on the Board of Medicine's website, and there was frequently asked questions about medical assistants and what they can do and what they can't do, very similar to veterinary assistants. However, medical assistants have had some sort of training, be it an RVT program. Veterinary assistants, not to upset Christy too much with the terminology of veterinary assistants, but that can be my nephew who's cleaning a kennel is considered a veterinary assistant. So in my opinion, it needs to be broached as an RVT only task, which would then by definition exclude veterinary assistants from performing these.
I mean, I think we've identified access and need and now harm are 3 of the metrics that need to be discussed. So the next question then is, what's the appropriate venue for having that? Is that something where somebody comes to this group and sits at that table and brings a proposal to us? Or do we try and form some sort of work group? And that would be more than just 2 people from this committee. That would involve stakeholders and actually try and drill down into that, and from that particular task force then get a response. I mean, I don't know that, I'm not trying to lead you, I just don't know what the right answer is here as we try and work through that. But it needs to be better than, well, this group today decided this was okay. I mean, that is part of how this committee got to be formed. There was the issue of the pocket door in the surgery suite, and there were some that had problems with it and others that didn't. And in the end, how that came to be was it was a group of people that just said, oh, I think that that's good, or I think that that's bad. And there needs to be some science to this, right? So how do we bring some science into this conversation in a way that's going to be as effective as possible and meet all those needs, discuss access, discuss need, and discuss harm in a way that we can do that, transparently and properly to make sure the animals are cared for.
I feel like we need to have some type of metrics in order to be able to determine this, because I don't disagree that things need to change from the 70s, but I also think that, where does the list end? And so that's my concern, is that the next thing you know, everything is an RVT only task, and I don't think that's right either. And so we need to have some guidelines so that when we're all gone, that it does it does continue, that the guidelines are clear, that no matter what, when technology advances, the guidelines stay very clear. And so how do we develop those guidelines? We have to be able to do something.
David?
I think another key point is that unless we involve the profession, CVMA members, the RVT Association members, members of the public, we're not going to have enough, as you said, metrics or database to convince the administrative law people that these changes are necessary. You're going to have cold, hard data. It can't just because it's a great idea that Christy and Dave liked and proposed and everybody voted for it and we decided to move it on. That's not going to pass review. I think we need to take a look at what tasks are being performed out there in the profession, and by whom and with the frequency, and then put a risk factor on them and take a look at that data and see where it leads us. Right now it's pretty wide open. Each veterinarian sitting in this room or at this table has the authority, as long as they don't fall into any of those things that are currently listed, you could pretty much let your staff do what you want as long as it's not surgery, diagnosis, or prognosis. And I'm not sure that's correct either.
I'd like to ask members of the public for input. If anybody has anything they'd like to add to the conversation at this point?
Dr. Klingberg?
Yes.
I have a comment. It's always amazed me that a certain percentage of our population can't read cursive. So I think literacy or communication skills should be added to the list as well, to make sure that there's proper communication between the professionals, the paraprofessionals, and the non-professionals.
As someone whose spouse cannot read his handwriting, and my spouse cannot read my handwriting, and the fact that I got C's in handwriting in school when
that
they
hits
actually
close to home then.
Yes,
Yeah.
you've really touched a nerve. Yeah. Back when we got grades for handwriting in school. Yeah.
Well, you're focusing on medical tests, which is way out of my area.
Yep.
But literacy or communication, I think, should be in there someplace as some sort of a standard.
I'm not disagreeing. I mean, it's written down, but what I want to do is create that group or whomever's going to look at this, and then we're going to throw all of this stuff at them and say, catch. Yeah. Members of the public, yes, please come forward and identify yourself.
Lynn Moon, Carved President. We certainly agree that these tasks do need to be reviewed, especially since, again, they were from the 70s. And Carved would be willing and able to help in any way and would certainly like to participate in this.
Yes, please come forward.
Cindy Sabley, RVT, since 1975. I feel old. Having been around in 1975 when all this got started, it certainly probably is time for an update. I don't know if looking at specific procedures or talking about groups of procedures under a certain name, Or, because you could go on forever listing procedure after procedure. But I certainly agree that a group should get together, look into this deeper, and, I mean, I'd be willing to help with that. But, it really needs to look at statistics, as much information as we can get from complaints in the past, the real-world events out there, and I would be focused on protecting the patient at all times.
Great. Any other, yes, please.
Good morning, Henry Brzezinski, Chief of El Dorado County Animal Services, also a CACTA board member. One of the concerns I have is the rabies specimen processing. I live in a small county. We have a lot of rabies suspects up there, and our staff process those animals in a timely, extremely timely manner for our local lab.
If I may stop you, that was lined out.
Okay,
in the,
all right. Thank you.
So we're good. Okay, we will not be discussing
Thank you.
that. Yes, yes.
Just one comment on something Dave brought up that I think is something that we need to consider. It's obviously an area that demonstrates risk, but I just want to remind those of you on the MDC in the audience that our role is to respond to potential risks of harm. It's not to advance the profession. So even if these tasks have not been updated since the 70s, the board's job is that's not where we should be focused. We should be focused on where there might be a line of public protection that's not being met or that is being perhaps overstepped. We talk about complaints, and I can tell you that I do know we have cases where, Candace can attest to this as well, where we have veterinary assistants that perform surgery. Regardless of whether you change this or not, that's still going to happen because those people already know this is wrong and it violates the law. So there are a certain number of people out there that just aren't going to follow the rules. And that's why you have enforcement. I don't think that it is an entirely enforcement-driven process where you don't need to have standards. I agree with standards. You got to work within some framework. But I just need to remind everybody here, our job is not to advance the profession. Our job is to respond to a risk. So the data needs to be clear that what we're doing is addressing a potential risk. And if that is brought forward, Candace and I can do our best to pull some data from the complaints that we've had over the last several years. But again, you're going to have a certain number of complaints regardless of whether or not you change the law. And people who don't want to follow the rules aren't going to follow the rules even when you change them. The other comment I want to make is, do we have a supervision problem or a delegation problem? Because it may not just be restricted tasks. It may be restating somehow that obviously the veterinarian is the person that's responsible for only delegating those duties that are appropriate for support personnel who either does or does not have formal training. So we're talking about a veterinary assistant that primarily their training is OJT, right? It's on-the-job training. And then an RVT that has formal curriculum. Well, obviously you're going to have a much more defined scope of responsibility for an RVT than you are a veterinary assistant by virtue of their training and preparation to be registered, right? They take an exam. A veterinary assistant is supposed to work under some form of direct supervision unless it's the VACSP and they're handling controlled substance, and that can be indirect. So their scope of responsibility should be limited, but it should be limited through delegation. And that is something that we have to keep in mind as we move forward with this process. If you're removing the judgment of the veterinarian from how they use their support personnel, you're really changing the scope of responsibility for the veterinarian in as much as you're excluding tasks from a veterinary assistant. And you do need to think about this in terms of access and some of these other areas that we've touched on today.
Other comments from the committee? Yes, David.
Actually, I just have a general question since we have the associations in the audience. Have any of the associations recently polled membership on their job descriptions in terms of tasks? I know that CVMA took a look recently at how long you've being a veterinarian, what you're earning, what you do, and those types of things. But have anybody drilled down specifically and looked at what someone does daily and the tasks that are being performed, or identifying any potential risks from the profession standpoint? Anybody? No?
I can tell you CARVTA has, but it's been a few years.
Been a few years.
Yes.
So basically, we don't have any current hard data anywhere that anybody knows of.
Yeah, Jennifer.
And just a comment, obviously I've been in shelter medicine for the last decade. These 7 issues are not an issue. When I was working in specialty medicine, there were plenty of veterinary assistants performing these. And as an RVT, I didn't necessarily have training in these specific things, but I knew that if I did something wrong, I had a license to lose. I think with a veterinary assistant, there's nothing holding them back from jumping the gun and trying to perform these duties. So again, it goes back to protecting the animal as the consumer.
Yes, Bill.
There was, years ago, OES, Office of Exam Services, when they validated the exams, both RVT and DVM, they did do a job analysis. It's been years since that's done. If you're really serious about looking at these, that would be something to talk about, because they went out into the profession and they asked all the questions, who's performing what, and they actually even ranked importance of job tasks being performed. So I don't know if OES could still provide that documentation, but it has been years since that was done.
So the Office of Professional Exam Services is currently doing an occupational analysis on the registered veterinary technician profession. So we'll have data that comes out of that, I believe, early next year, Ethan. Yeah, so early 2018. Oh, this year. We're going to get it this year. So we will have some survey data. In fact, the survey had already went out, and I believe we collected the survey results. I think CARVTA sent it out, CVMA sent it out. I don't know, Dave, if you got it, or Christy. Well, since you were born in 1888, it was difficult to get it to you in the grade. But we did, in fact, send out a survey. Jennifer, were you a recipient of that survey? Okay. So we did recently send out a survey. Those results have been collected by OPES, and they're being tabulated. So that should be helpful. It won't, however, discuss what a veterinary assistant does or doesn't do, because it's not part of the survey. It's about RVTs. But we should at least frame what's happening in the profession today in terms of tasks that RVTs are commonly doing.
Is this, are we talking about the practice analysis for tests? I mean, when we had the discussion about the relief hole back in the day, at that point, it was the fact that rated high in what was the harm scale, if I'm remembering the terminology correctly, on the practice analysis. And again, the practice analysis is a tool to determine the appropriateness of an exam question and how often it should appear in an exam. And I testified to the Vet Med Board at that time that a fecal analysis actually was higher on the harm scale than the relief hole, the need for a relief hole was, and therefore should we be restricting a fecal analysis as an RVT task if we're going to use that metric? It's actually, it's an interesting conversation point, the practice analysis, but it has to do with tests. It doesn't actually have to do with consumer protection in any way, shape, or form. It's about the frequency of something that's going to be seen in practice. And so, again, it's an interesting tool, but by no means do I want to see that particular tool transmuted into something then that is used to assign job tasks. I think it's a very inappropriate use of it. Yes.
Yes. It's strictly there to validate the test and nothing more. There's a vast difference between a test validation study and a study and analysis of what goes on a day-to-day basis in any different practice setting.
Yes, Christy.
Well, I want to go back to, we have to be careful with, we can't say, oh, we want to add this many new job tasks to RVTs because then we're monopolizing the field. And so I I really think that it has to be more about, we're always going to get, I don't think it's ever going to come back to, we're always gonna get people asking us to add job tasks. So we have to have some type of thing that we can go to and say, it doesn't fit our criteria. So that we have reasons to be able to say yes or no. And it has to be a consumer-related reason.
So what I would like to ask this committee for is the authorization to go to the Veterinary Medical Board tomorrow and suggest that a group or a task force committee, whatever you want to call it, be formed to develop a tool or guideline that would help us determine the appropriateness of a task within the scope of practice for veterinary assistants and or RVTs. And so that would be the proposal. Any issues with that? What do you think, Kurt? Your motion on that?
Yeah, Dr. Klingberg, I do think since you're essentially asking authorization from the board to do that, I just would comment a couple things. Number one, my presumption is, and correct me if I'm wrong, please. First of all, whoever had the over of me not talking this, way to keep this silent just one. That this would be probably constitute more than 3 members and therefore require full-on notice and agenda so that we could have cast a wide net, if you will. Okay. So with that being said, I think it would be appropriate for the MDC to consider that in the form of a motion because, like I said, it would require authorization from the board.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, maybe if I wrote that in cursive, nobody would read it.
So if I may have someone make that motion.
So moved.
Okay, we have a motion. Okay. Motion and a second, and essentially it's to ask the VMB to create a working group to help develop a tool or guidelines to determine the appropriateness of scope of practice changes for veterinary assistants and RVTs. I think there's an understanding that it will involve stakeholders, including members of this committee, the Vet Med Board, the CVMA, CARVTA, and other stakeholders. Any questions on that? We've got a motion and a second. Public comment? All in favor? Aye.
Dr. Klingberg.
Aye.
Dr. Juices.
Aye.
Dr. Grant.
Aye.
Dr. Pollard.
Aye.
Dave Johnson.
Aye.
Christy Pulowski.
Aye.
Diana Woodward-Hagel. Jennifer Laredo.
Aye.
And Dr. Sullivan.
Aye. Okay, that motion carries. That is our discussion at this point on item 5. And so we're now moving to item 8, which is a discussion and consideration of recommendations from the State Humane Association of California and CVMA regarding public and private shelters and minimum standards and protocols for shelter medicine. I did omit in moving forward the CVMA premises language that has been developed. It was in your packet last time, so if you brought your packet last time, then you have it. And if not, I think that we may have had some copies handed out today as well on that if you need that. But I'd like to ask Erica Hughes to give us a report if possible about where she is in all of this.
Pardon me, Dr. Klingberg.
Yes.
What document are you referring to?
Good morning.
Morning.
Would you like me to just go ahead and say where we are with it? Okay. So just to continue from the conversation that we had at the last MDC meeting, I think the most important thing for shelters at this point is to make sure that it's lawful for unregistered assistants in the, or sorry, veterinary assistants, sorry, Christy, in the, I know. I actually think of you every time I say that term. Veterinary assistants in a shelter setting to be able to perform certain basic tasks upon intake that include performing a physical exam, administering vaccines such as distemper, parvo, bordetella, and others, administering medicine for the prophylactic treatment of parasites, and to do certain important testing for cats for things such as FELV, FIV, and screening for ringworms. And that needs to, that shelter staff that are not registered, so veterinary assistants, that they will be permitted to do that without a veterinarian present, as long as there are written protocols in place that guide the shelter staff. We think it's important because it acknowledges the unique needs and demands that are present in a shelter, while at the same time balancing the welfare of all the animals that come in, both the ones that are owned and will be redeemed by owners and the ones that are stray, as well as safeguarding the health and safety of the general public. And I know that the language that CVMA submitted last time set forth some language that would specifically allow that for RVTs, and we are respectfully requesting that those duties also be, that shelter staff that are not licensed also be allowed to perform those functions.
So Eric and I had a conversation recently about what it would take to essentially, an exemption may not be the right word, but allow for these intake triage responsibilities to be delegated to a veterinary assistant. And clearly this is something that would require a statutory change. So when you look at how we're going to address some of the shelter medicine needs, you need to look at the kind of hierarchy of what has to happen first before you can move into that next phase. So I asked Erica to consider what that might look like, what type of statutory change might be appropriate in terms of what their requests are. And, we looked at 4840, we looked at 4827, so we looked at some of the provisions that are currently in the Practice Act that seem to address shelter medicine as a unique setting. There was also a request from SHAC regarding the euthanasia training, in that there's this unique requirement of 3 years of teaching prior to being eligible to be certified as an instructor for euthanasia training, and that's been a very difficult burden for instructors to overcome because they're lacking instructors for individuals to be trained in euthanasia as euthanasia technicians. So that's something else the MDC should consider as either a recommendation to the board or not, but that is something that we could change by regulation and wouldn't require a statutory change. So in terms of hierarchy, as I see it, it's first addressing what law changes need to occur, and then moving into the regulatory scheme from there. And I know that Erica had indicated that she was working with CVMA to kind of discuss what that might look like. And it would be helpful to have a proposal for the MDC to consider.
Yeah, and I just want to underscore from our perspective, we want to make sure that we're in agreement with CVMA and with the with CACTA and all of the stakeholders that are that this would affect. I think it's important for us all to be on the same page. This shouldn't be at all an adversarial process. And then one other thing I wanted to add is I also think we need to consider what sort of training we would want to require either within the statute or by reg, because I think this is one of the things that people get on the job training for in shelters, but would it make sense to have either a formal curriculum like we do for euthanasia, or do we want to leave it up to the discretion of the veterinarian who's writing the protocol and ultimately responsible for what the shelter staff is doing? But I think I just want to make it clear that I don't think any of us think it would be in the best interest of the public or of the animals to have untrained people performing these functions. That I just want to underscore how important we think the training aspect of that is.
Yes, Jennifer.
You had mentioned that we were trying to figure out a way to make it okay for the assistants. In shelter medicine, we talk about triage. I actually looked up the definition according to Army medicine, and it's doing the greatest good for the greatest number. And in shelter medicine, we also have exigent circumstances. And in shelters, it's always an exigent circumstance. We're always overpopulated. We're always understaffed. So I'm thinking we could try to plagiarize some of the guidelines with that to enable the veterinary assistants to be able to treat these animals that are emergent. I know just the other morning, I was the first person in the shelter and there was a dog hit by a car. It's great. I'm the RVT. I have keys, but I have a veterinary assistant who's there as early as I am, who's perfectly capable of following the guidelines that our shelter vet has posted on her office door. And should the assistant stand there and stare at this dog that's in pain, or should he treat it in some way? So I'm thinking that that's an exigent circumstance. That's my comment.
Yes.
And there are circumstances up and down the state where, due to the rural nature and the low population density, there aren't any RVTs to serve in shelters. We have a shelter in Blythe. There's not an RVT that lives within 100 miles of Blythe. And it would be virtually impossible to operate that shelter under the strictest of these terms.
And also just to say too, for the record, that that this change in law would really just be bringing the law into line with current practice. This has been the industry-wide practice throughout the state. Veterinary assistants routinely, every day, all day throughout the state, perform these functions already. And I know the BMB is aware of that and actually had an informal policy to that effect for years.
Can I ask a question, either Jennifer, Erica, or Tuesday? Did you say you worked in a shelter setting?
I did.
Okay. So, Jennifer, you mentioned that. Oh,
I work in the shelter.
you work in the shelter. Okay, Ellen. You indicated that the veterinary assistant that was there while you weren't there was very capable of handling the situation. So, in your experience, your collective shelter experience, what type of training do these individuals get when they're hired? So, they're hired as veterinary assistants at the shelter. Is there a formal on-the-job training for public shelters or private shelters? Is it uniform? Is that something that we could look at as maybe that ground level assurance?
Well, I'll start because I have the microphone. We're pretty unique at the shelter I am at in Harupa Valley. I have only 3 assistants and they're all in school. I have the one I was referring to is actually just waiting to take his exams. So I don't think that's the norm. I don't think shelters across California have little baby RVTs in school trying to go through. But there is on-the-job training. There's a probationary period. And going back to Christy and her definitions, we have our kennel attendants who are considered a veterinary assistant by the law, but they have no training. And then we have our veterinary assistants who work directly with the RVTs and they get on-the-job training there. We don't quiz them, but we don't allow them to do anything that we're unsure that they're comfortable doing. So sadly, that's not the norm.
And we don't keep them if they don't measure up. That's the important part.
I can tell you, I also work at a municipal shelter, and we're lucky to get any help we can get at my particular shelter. So we've been very fortunate that we've been able to bring people in to be assistants. Their training has all been on the job, and I'm a real stickler for the rules and what their training is and what we're comfortable with, because not only my license, it's my veterinarian's license on the line, but we do not have a formal training program. And having assistants is really, really recent for our shelter, even though we're a large municipality. It's just been within the last 2 years that we've actually had that.
Okay. David, then Alan.
Emery, I can share some additional information from our shelter system for you, because obviously I was actively involved in it. What Erica is describing in terms of tasks is commonly in the shelter community referred to as intakes, things that you do when the animal is brought into the shelter. And in our formal situation, we have two groups of individuals that provide intake to the animals because of the two ways the animals come in. They either come in with the patrol staff or they come in over the counter from the public. Those are two ways that animals come into the shelter. Those two groups of people, whether they be an animal control officer or an animal care attendant, by law would be considered unregistered assistant or a veterinary assistant for just terminology's sake. The animal control officers actually have a formal academy in which the medical department teaches curriculum-based subjects on vaccination, animal disease, proper handling of vaccine, and they have to complete that training and actually do the laboratory work associated with it to become an animal control officer. So there is, in that avenue, a documented form of training for those people to do the intake procedures. On the other side, the animal care attendants, that is strictly on-the-job training. But that training is provided directly by the registered veterinary technicians, and those people are not allowed to perform those tasks until they have been checked off in all the proper categories of proper administration, handling, and all those types of situations. Now, being in a large municipal shelter, we have the luxury of being able to do that with a large staff and medical overseeing the entire situation. We have to constantly keep in mind what we heard at the last meeting is there's small shelters out there, just like we're hearing today. And so, we can talk about training standards and everything. We just have to be careful about how they're applied. I believe those standards need to be there. We just need to make sure that we're not putting such a burden on the shelters that they can't meet those standards. We can't set them up for failure. Yes.
If I can, not all animal control officers, go through Humane Academy. Some are strictly on-the-job training, and they don't have that formal education.
I can give a shout out to CVMA right now, and perhaps they can come up and describe in more detail the program. But what we've done is, in addition to the on-the-job training, I have insisted that all of our, in some cases, animal care technicians, in some cases, veterinary assistants, in some cases, actually working out of class, there would be office assistants, enroll in and take and finish the CVMA program. And we have found that invaluable in providing a background of everything from front counter protocols to hygiene to actual medicine and surgery. So there is something out there that could be used or could be suggested. I realize that we probably can't require that, but it is a modality that has proved its worth.
Dr. Druses, how long is that training, or maybe CVMA? How long does that training last? And
It's self-paced,
oh,
and we like to see it get done in 6 months, but we extend that out as long as they're making progress. And actually, what else we do? We've had the county pays for the tuition for our employees to become RVTs. But as a first step, I require that they enroll and complete the CVMA program to make sure that they're academically and physically, mentally motivated to actually do it. And so from that perspective, it's very good. Val, do you want to?
Sure, just a couple things. Valerie Fenstermaker, CVMA. The Certified Veterinary Assistant Program is a self-paced program of PowerPoint and videos that takes a veterinary assistant through a certification program, and it has an exam at the end that has to be passed in order to get the certification. and that's what Dr. Ducey's is referring to. Just on another note, from what our premises task force submitted, did only address RVTs at the time. Our task force talked to both veterinarians who are at shelters and do written protocols, and also to RVTs at shelters, and that seemed to be the direction that they felt we should address at the time. I will add that our board would certainly revisit the veterinary assistant, potentially with some training being added to the section that we submitted. But I can't speak for our board without taking it back to them. We actually have a board meeting this weekend, and I can certainly take this concept back to them, and we can revisit it.
And Val, just for everybody's knowledge, how many modules are there in the veterinary? I'm putting you on
You're
the spot.
asking the wrong person.
Well, I don't know, that's why I'm asking
There's a
you.
lot. It's a very comprehensive
Yes.
program, and as I say, it also has a mentor at the practice. The assistant does not just do it on their own. They have to have a mentor at the practice, either an RVT or a veterinarian, who oversees the experience part and makes sure that they're completing all of the courses. And again, the exam is very comprehensive, and we don't give the exam. It's done by a separate entity that we work with.
Any other questions for Val?
Thank you.
So we started this maybe about a year ago now, and Dr. Druces and Dave Johnson put together a list of statutes and regulations that needed to be revisited in regards to shelter medicine. And simultaneously, there was a discussion that started at the CVMA level with the premises task force that also included some stakeholders from the shelter community, because there's a premise component to this conversation. And that's the language we were just talking about. And then we realized we actually needed to cast an even wider net, and that's where we had the shelter community at the last meeting with input. And so here we are today now, and we've got really 3 different kinds of documents that all fit together into this gigantic jigsaw puzzle that we're certainly not going to solve in one meeting or 2 meetings. But my question now, and I'm going to turn this back over to you, is where do we go from here? What's our next step?
Well, I think the next step is to get the stakeholders together and probably sit down and hammer out some language. Then I guess that would need to be considered by the board. And so I think it would make sense to have representatives from CVMA, from SHAC, and from CACTA. Those are the 3 most important stakeholders. And that we would come back with a proposal for the board. So would the proposal be, would we bring the proposal back to the MDC, and then the MDC would propose? Okay. So I think ideally I would like to get that done before the next MDC meeting and have that submitted.
Comments, questions from the committee? Yes.
Pardon me. As part of the task force report, I would appreciate it if you would start out with a very clear code or regulation-based description of the duties, the permissible duties presently of veterinarians, RVTs, registered veterinary assistants, and unregistered assistants. Because I am not clear looking through where presently the demarcations are. And I think that would be a good starting point for your analysis.
Okay.
Because I do see that biannually veterinary assistants have to renew their controlled substance permits or something along those lines. And that might may or may not impact on your assessment. I think it's always good to start out with what you have presently. And of course, my continuing gripe with the Veterinary Practice Act is that the index is deficient. So that when I look at what unregistered assistants can do, I see they can perform what's called auxiliary animal health tasks. But I can't find a definition of that. And so you may have a number of footnotes saying, well, we tried to follow up and, we couldn't exactly get a clear understanding of what some of the terms are. And if you can't, then the ordinary practitioner can't. But I've heard in this discussion from people in shelter medicine that unregistered assistants are described as kennel cleaners or other tasks that I get kennel cleaners, I understand that. But are they just people who pass through off the street and maybe it's an entry-level job? I just don't know. So,
Yeah, I think if you're not an RVT and you're not a veterinarian, then you're a veterinary assistant, and you could be anyone. I mean, we're all veterinary assistants, I suppose. I mean, not
Right.
those of you who have licenses, but those of us who don't have license, I mean, you're a veterinary assistant.
Exactly. And I don't mean to necessarily broaden, the scope of the task force, but is it different in a shelter medicine setting where you may have volunteers or unpaid people who don't have that formal employer-employee relationship or some other relationship that's more voluntary than paid? I'm just throwing that out as a starting point.
Okay, thank you.
So Erica, what I would ask, I'm going to put even more pressure on you, unfortunately, because I'm going to ask that what the task force or subcommittee or working group that looks at this comes up with, we need to have something in writing by the time that our packet goes out for our next meeting.
Okay.
Because you've got to have time to research that, and that's roughly 3 weeks prior to our next meeting. So I don't remember the date of our next meeting, but we
I'll look
can
it up.
certainly figure that out. Okay. And try and get some language together as we've got these different pieces of the puzzle. Yes? Can you come to the microphone, thanks? April 18th, okay. So by the end of March then.
Respectfully, I feel you guys are missing a major stakeholder. You need to allow the RVTs on this discussion as well.
Well,
So
I think
Carver
that we
would like
talked
to
about,
represent.
Carved, I believe, was mentioned, so, yeah.
Did I miss that?
Yeah.
No, I didn't say that.
Okay.
I completely agree with you. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So yes.
I don't think we've missed them at all, but
Okay,
yes.
okay.
Okay.
Apologize.
Yes, that's okay.
Yeah. And I have one question just for clarification. So we're talking here about shelters that have a premises permit as well as shelters that don't have a premises permit. Is that correct?
So if they're practicing veterinary medicine, they should have a premises permit. Whether or not there's a waiver for what they pay is for private versus public. Public shelters, their fees are exempt or they're waived for registration.
So I guess so. If we're talking just about these minimal procedures on intake, and we decide that's outside of the practice of veterinary medicine, then
That discussion hasn't been had.
okay. So we need to contemplate that it may be part of that a shelter may need to get a premises permit to do this, or may not because it's exempted.
Because right now, it's every shelter where you're performing even these intake procedures, which are considered veterinary medicine, should be holding a registration with the board, premises registration. So if there is some notion that they would be exempt then from the registration process, I don't think that's been contemplated that I'm aware of. Okay, so that's something that we need to bring forward.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll take a quick break.
Yep. Okay,
Before-
let's,
Dr.
yes.
Klingberg, before I leave our saga here, so the thing that that MDC is gonna bring back, I was gonna say tomorrow to the vet med is that on this issue, we're anticipating a legislative proposal. Is that kind of where we left it?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. far be it from me to stand in the way of a break, but.
All right, let's take a 10-minute break. On item number 8, which was moved up in our agenda, a discussion and consideration of recommendations from SHAC and the CVMA regarding shelters. We've gone through the first part of that conversation, and we're now going to be viewing and discussing PowerPoint, and then have one other item within this group to discuss. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Druses.
Well, thank you. So just a little background as to what I've done. We have a couple vaccination clinics per month in Riverside. We used to have a vendor come in and do them for us, but we had some issues associated with accessibility. In other words, if we allowed one vendor in, we'd have to allow anybody who said they wanted to do it. And so I brought everything in-house. And so as a result, we have on the first Wednesday evening, starting at 6 o'clock, and on the third Saturday morning, starting at 9 o'clock, we have a vaccination microchip clinic. The thing that really struck me in the beginning was certainly, I do all the ones on Wednesday. We have staff veterinarian does the Saturday clinics. What struck me in the beginning is why people in all kinds of weather, I realize this is California, but still it's hot in the summer and it's pretty chilly in the winter. It rains. Why they would stand in line for 3-4 hours to get their dog vaccinated. And as a matter of fact, the latest we were was 2 o'clock in the morning. I left. We've become much more efficient, so now we're generally out of there by 11:30 or midnight. We stopped the line at 8 o'clock. This is all just to give you a background of what goes on. And at one of these clinics, the last person in line had one dog and wanted one rabies shot. That's it. $6 for rabies, and waited 5 hours in line. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I got better things to do with my time. But this apparently, what struck me is a service that people want, and they're willing to do that. So I set up a questionnaire, asked virtually all the patrons, the owners, the same set of questions. I let them respond. I kind of collated the responses in broad categories. For example, they would respond, well, I come here because it's convenience. Well, convenient means different things to different people. I didn't have the time to go into great depth, but from experience, I can tell you, and we can get to that later, how they define convenient. And the other operative word was cheap. I preferred that they would call us inexpensive, but they insisted on calling us cheap. So, all right, before I begin, anybody know where this is? Little geography lesson here.
South Australia.
It's the Ocean Highway in South, and what are these formations called?
12 apostles.
12? No.
11 now. 10.
9. You got they got the stumps of the ones in the foreground there. Yes. So it's a beautiful place. All right. Oh, this is the pointer. Okay. So Southern Victoria, near Melbourne. This does not seem to be where. Oh, there we go.
Dr. Druses, before you continue,
Yes.
we just need to make sure that we're not violating any agenda protocol here. We need to make sure we continue to tie this back to the shelter.
Yes.
So if you can highlight in your discussion, not everybody understands right now that you're talking about shelter staff doing these works at the vaccination clinic. So it appears like we're veering off topic. So just bring us back.
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
So I'm the veterinarian that does the Wednesdays. And I take direct involvement in the process. But The staff that assists me are RVTs and sometimes veterinary assistants. Depends on the scheduling and the time of year and all that kind of stuff. So this is an important aspect of what we do as a animal control jurisdiction, but it is also an important aspect of what the Veterinary Medical Board needs to know what goes on at these things. So one of the questions I asked was, how many pets do you currently own? I can't read this from here, but I'll just read it from down here. So most everybody did not own a menagerie, certainly less than 4. Very infrequently would we have somebody coming in with 3 or more animals. Usually then it was a litter of puppies. So these are average pet owners. I'll get to that here in a minute. When was this pet last taken to a veterinarian? So that's the animal that they presented to us. When was it last seen by a veterinarian? Almost half of these animals had never been seen by a veterinarian. This brings access into the discussion. We've had the discussion about access in the past. I believe this, again called superficial data, emphasizes the point that virtually half of the animals never been to a vet, 3/4 of them hadn't been in years. And I realized, as I acknowledged the spelling mistake there. When did you last take any pet to a veterinarian? So, some of these animals hadn't been in 5 years. A lot of them had never been to a veterinarian as well. Again, these are residents of the county of Riverside. And I guess I should have stated from the beginning that this is from the Riverside/Europa City County Animal Shelter in the city of Europa Valley. We're not talking about Blythe here. We're talking about pretty much the city of Riverside. And there are plenty of veterinary practices around, yet apparently a good portion of the population of the city of Riverside and the environs do not visit veterinarians.
Dr. Drusis?
Yes.
I need a little clarification. Is the pie chart measuring persons interviewed or number of animals?
The first slide was the number of animals that the owner presented to us, and that was 1 or 2. This slide is that the animal that you presented, no, this is, if you have 1 or 2 animals at home, when was the last time you took any of those animals to a veterinarian? Any vet, anywhere, at any time.
Oh, no, I mean owners. Is it?
I asked these questions of the animal owners, mostly dogs. We did have a small portion of cats present.
So it's not measuring number of animals, it's measuring number of interviewees.
This chart is a reflection of that.
Okay, thank you.
The number of animals we see on a average deployment, if you will, is between 150 and 200 animals.
Which would be different from the number of owners, interviewees.
Correct, but most of the owners are there with 1 or 2 animals. As an example for everyone, generally speaking, we gross about $10,000 a clinic. And like I said, the doors open at 8, at 6 on the Wednesday ones. We cut the line at midnight because there are a lot of sick people that would show up at 3 minutes to 8 and then not have to stand in line for so long, or we'd never go home. So we do cut the line. what kind of beast is this? Not showing up at the clinics, so. Somebody's been to to Victoria. There's a fairy penguin chick, yes. Mommy and Daddy are out there in the great wilds of the Southern Ocean getting food for this cute little thing. This is the chart that says how many animals the owner brought in at that point in time, at that clinic. So most of them, through almost 3/4 of them, only bring in one animal. Why do they only bring in one animal? The cynic in me says that they only want to admit to owning one animal. The other question that I asked is how many do they own? And a lot of them do own 2 animals. Well, and most of them are dogs, because most of the time people don't even consider the cat that they feed on the back stoop to be theirs anyway, so why should they acknowledge that to me? And we'll get, fine, is this the next, so here we are. What I did here is trying to have a comparison to assumed data. So in other words, both the AVMA and the Pet Products Association people have a formula that is supposed to estimate the number of pets that people have. Obviously, the pet products industry does it so for marketing reasons, but essentially for dogs, it's 36% of the households each own 1.6 dogs. So you can kind of figure out what the licensing penetration would be, a public health important number. But it also provides here then a metric of how honest these people were with me. So if they all only have 1 or 2 dogs, that fits in exactly with the 1.6 pets per household. And the data that I teased out of this is that, so the average number of pets in the home is 2, and the median is 2. So that from a mathematical statistical perspective, you know those numbers are pretty close if the mean and the average are about the same. The average age of the pets that people presented to us, again, this is only the pets that presented to the vaccination clinic, almost 3 years. The median age, 2 years. The last bullet point is the most important, I feel, that a little more than 1/3 of the pets presented aged 1 year or greater had never seen a veterinarian. Now, from a public health perspective and an access perspective, that's important, because when is the time that they get their first rabies vaccination? They should get it by the time they're 5 months old. We give them 30 days. So 4 months they have to be, and they have to be licensed in the state of California. Clearly, these animals are neither vaccinated nor licensed. And that percent rose to 50% of the pets age 2 or more. I mean, so these are significant numbers, I feel, at least for the county of Riverside. And we can ask if the jurisdictions in the audience have similar impressions of who their clientele is. And we all know from the fact that when animals come, when owners come to redeem their dogs that are impounded, that most of the time we do have to give them rabies vaccinations because they're not current, because they've never been to a veterinarian. So the question then became, do you have a regular veterinarian? So I just would ask them, hey, you have a regular vet? And what's the answer? 2/3 of them. 2/3 of them don't have one. Can't hardly get an animal vaccinated from a public health perspective if neither the owner nor the animal has a veterinarian to go to. And even those that had vets, they still come to us, which brings us to this. So it adds up to more than 100% because a lot of people gave more than one response. Again, this was free. I did not ask them. They acknowledged on their own why they were there. And as you can see, most common response, almost 80%, was because we were inexpensive. We provided value for their time. Now, I know that some of these people, most of these people, all of the people, were lying when they only responded, a citation brought them there. Because I would see them holding the citations. I hover around, and especially at the cash registers and where the receipts are processed, and I know that they ask the question, well, what do I do with my citation now that I've complied? So the fact that only 20% or 15% of them said a citation drove them there, I know it's the licensing officers, it's the animal control officers with a gun to their head with a citation that's fully correctable, that drove them there. But we do provide value for these people. And convenient, I touched a little bit in the beginning about what defines convenience. Well, a lot of us think who do this that because we offer a one-stop shop. So they have a citation, they need a vaccination, they have to buy a license, they can get all that stuff done when they come to one of these clinics, as opposed to perhaps going to a veterinarian, getting the vaccination there, going to City Hall and getting the license there, maybe forgetting about the microchip, having to make another trip somewhere to get, we get it all in one shot. Yes, sir?
So, forgive my ignorance, but what's the citation if they don't comply? About how much is it?
Okay, so the state law has provisions for administrative citations. It's a $100 violation. So what our, for the most part, licensing officers, we call them now, they canvass neighborhoods, knock on doors. If they hear or see we have, well, now they have tablets where they can bring up the database and determine whether there are any licensed dogs at that location. If they see a German Shepherd and see that there's a Dalmatian license there, they know that this Shepherd is in violation. Whether the owner's there or not, just like when you get a parking ticket, they don't wait around for you to show up. We put a door hanger with the citations on it. Most of them, it's all low-hanging fruit right now for our officers, because most of them are the 4 UNs, poetic license. Unvaccinated, unlicensed, unmicrochipped, and we have secondary enforcement, spay-neuter. They would then have to get their animals spayed or neutered because they were not a responsible pet owner in the first place. So each one of these violations is a $100 fine if they dismiss it. If they say, you're never going to find me. Eventually we would, and without coming into compliance, it's $100 for each violation. They're fully dismissible once they're compliant. There's only a small charge for administration fee of processing these things.
And you don't pay your fine, you can't renew your driver's license and.
Unfortunately, we can't go that far. We are not that Gestapo-like.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, what happens if they don't pay the violations? They get, there's admin cites 1s, admin cites 2s, so it's a progressive citation that gets their attention, or hopefully gets their attention. If they've thoroughly dismissed the whole thing, we submit to the Franchise Tax Board, and we attach their tax returns the following year. That really gets people's attention. Yes?
What's the rate of compliance?
Well, that's hard to say. Once we catch them, it's upwards of 90-something%. I would have to, I've frankly never run that exact statistic on a yearly basis. But once the cycle goes through and they either pay up or we garnish it and then they come down and license and vaccinate their animal, it's pretty high. But on the basis of the number of dog owning households in a community, I haven't done that.
Alan, do you send them on to a collection agency first, or you just send it right on to the FTV?
Well, this is getting a little off topic here, but fine, to complete the whole process, we do everything in-house. We found that a third-party provider siphoned money off the top to process everyone, and it wasn't a legitimate undertaking from our perspective.
Dr. Drusis?
Yes.
Did I hear you correctly when you said that the monetary portion of the citation would be forgiven if they came into compliance with which of the four aspects?
Well, if they have the four uns, they have to do all four. They have to get vaccinated, have to get licensed, have to get a microchip, and have to get spayed or neutered.
And in that case, they will the citation
are voided.
Will be voided.
Yes.
Question, does the notice of citation, which the officer hangs on the doorknob, does that state that
Yes.
there is a pathway to be?
Yes.
Because I'm concerned somebody will say, oh, I'll just turn in the animal, to animal control.
Good point. Our data indicates that, and I didn't include that here, that the number of stray animals impounded or owner turn-ins has not increased through this. Our philosophy is we want people to keep we're talking about dogs essentially. We want people to keep their dogs. We want people to be compliant. So we don't offer, we hand them a citation with one hand and we offer them a solution with another. The solution are these vaccination clinics. The solution is spay-neuter clinics that we operate. We have a bus that goes in, a mobile spay-neuter vehicle that goes into the communities to help these people. And we have grants that actually make the process virtually. There are some grants I have that the only thing the owners need to do to comply is to buy a license. We'll do everything else because a grant pays for it. So all the other responses to why they attended the clinic are in a very low percentages, recommended by somebody, recommended by had past experience with us. They saw a little flyer that we may have had. One gentleman said his wife made him come, so, but I did not include that one. All right. Kind of wrapping things up here. So with respect to the question about what happens to these animals or the owner's compliance and do they give these animals up, the answer is no. This is the city of Riverside and the entirety of the unincorporated Riverside County. The top brown are the number of dogs older than 1 year of age. That number has stays in the 5 years between 12 and 16, relatively constant. This is a lot of licensed dogs. Impounded stray dogs. As you can see, over the 5-year period, the number of young dogs, that means puppies in the first year or under 6 months of age and dogs under a year of age, has decreased dramatically. And so have impounds generally, whether they be for strays, owner surrenders, confiscates. From a public health perspective, this again solves a number of issues. The fewer animals that are running the streets on their own, the fewer bites you're going to have. Don't have data to back that up yet because that's a difficult number to tease out. But nevertheless, impounds are down. You can do a better job if you have the right tools. The vaccination clinics and the admin sites and licensing penetration are the key to doing this. And the non-dog owning populace benefits from this, certainly the dog owning population, and from a public health perspective, this is the way to go. For those of you who have been in southern Victoria, this is the coast on Gippsland, also a very nice place to be. Any questions? All right, so I hope that this little presentation stimulates some discussion about the validity of some of the things that we have discussed and will discuss. Can't do these activities without RVTs. You can't do them without veterinary assistance. And it's an integral part. I mean, it is something the state requires us to, they say plural, so you can get by doing 2 rabies clinics a year. We do 2 a month. We probably could do more, but from a staffing perspective, even we don't have the ability to do that.
Great. Any comments from the committee? From the public on this line item? Anything else at this point on item number 8? So committee, we either are going to break for lunch at 12:30 and start working for the next 30 minutes on the next line item, or we're going to break for lunch now and come back. Either way, you get an hour for lunch, but do you want to do 30 minutes more work, or are you ready? Yes. Yeah, keep going for a little bit? All right, let's move on to our next line item, and that is item 6. Discussion and consideration of proposed amendments to RVT job tasks. So, background on this, I'm actually going to punt. I'm going to ask Anne Marie to give us the background on this, because it actually goes back to Sunset Review in some ways.
Right. So let me get my place here and we'll begin the discussion. So we started this discussion surrounding rodeo and what would in fact, if it would in fact be appropriate for an RVT to be on site at a rodeo with a veterinarian on call. And the legislature made the request of the Veterinary Medical Board to consider that policy statement or that protocol as acceptable so that there's someone there monitoring the animals at the rodeo. So both the MDC and the Veterinary Medical Board discussed this at length in terms of whether or not the RVT could, under the current structure, provide necessary care and treatment to the animals at the rodeo with a veterinarian on call. And we looked at what was already in existence in 2069, which allows for RVTs to perform some emergency animal health care tasks in the absence of a veterinarian. That became the kind of jumping off point for this discussion. And the next issue was, is this list all inclusive, or is there something that needs to be added here so that RVTs can do that on-site care and treatment for animals that are injured at a rodeo? The one remaining item that wasn't here is what's included in this document today, and that's about the administration of drugs. But because Section 2069 does not just deal with the rodeo scenario, it deals with any emergency situation where an RVT may be able to intervene and provide prompt and necessary care. We needed to make sure that we structured this language to speak to all emergency situations. Unless we were going to create a section that was rodeo specific, which didn't seem to be a reasonable solution to this problem, Kurt, Dr. Klingborg, and myself worked on this language so that this would be true for any emergency situation where the administration of some sort of pain medication or sedation could be appropriately administered by an RVT under a protocol from a veterinarian or some sort of direct order from a veterinarian, whether it be at a rodeo or whether it be at another, accident scene, what have you. The other layer to this that I think it's important to recall, if you will, and discuss again is that if an RVT is on site at a rodeo where animals are injured and they're not getting prompt and necessary treatment and care according to what the provisions say in the penal code, the RVT would then be in a position to call animal control. So there's some reporting of what's not happening that should happen under the penal code. So I think it does serve two purposes, and it seems like a reasonable solution to a problem that we're trying to help mitigate, and that's what's before the MDC today.
Discussion, David?
Yeah, I'd like to start the discussion off with just some background information in a slightly different area to show you that you've written an excellent inclusive paragraph here, because when it started with just the rodeo, I had some concerns that it was too focused on rodeos alone. I will share with you some personal experiences from the animal control field. One of the things that happens on a regular basis is animals get themselves into situations where they need to be rescued. And the problem that presents is the fact that usually either an animal control officer is called first, or in many instances, for some reason, the public calls the fire department. And then the fire department sees that it's an animal and contacts the local animal shelter or the local humane society. Then you have jurisdictional issues, but you have all these people there, and usually then, because the public channels are being monitored, then you have the news media there. And I can tell you from personal experiences over the years that I've had to go into the field and deal with animals impaled on rebar, animals that have their heads stuck in pool filters, animals that have their toes stuck in drains, animals that have fallen down a ravine or in a deep cavern somewhere and need to be sedated to successfully remove them. And the law right now is very gray, to the point where probably there was a little much too liberty taken. But what happens is most of the time the owners are present. So you tell the owners, you need to contact your veterinarian. Well, guess what kind of response they get? I'm in private practice. I'm not going to come out there in the middle of the night and get your dog's head stuck out of the pool drain.
Or they don't even have a veterinarian.
Or they don't even have a veterinarian. So then the local animal control agency or humane society is responsible. Well, the animal control officer doesn't have the training. Now, granted, there were some changes within the last few years that stated an animal control officer can use controlled substances to capture an animal. But those were stray animals running loose for the purpose of rabies control, not to capture that animal because it was in distress. So this is a great start, because you could make the argument that by sedating that animal with its foot in the drain or with its head captured somewhere or whatever, you're preventing further injury. And I'm happy to say in all the cases I was involved in that the issue of sedating the animal facilitated the rescue and no one lost their life. And so, yes, have I done a half a dozen or a dozen cases myself? Yes, but I'm sure these cases occur up and down the state. And I think in some instances, unfortunately, the decision is made to euthanize the animal because there is no other option. And so I think this is an excellent start to address the public's access to services in situations where animal safety and health is at risk.
Yes.
I assume from this we're talking about controlled drugs? And if we are we not violating the Veterinary Drug Mobility Act?
Well, we've not stipulated what drugs. I mean, obviously, there's controlled drugs that could potentially be involved, but this language is open-ended.
Well, I think it needs to be clarified.
Well, let's just say we're using acepromazine then. I mean, I think that we can, at some point, we've got to find some way of helping these animals.
No question, but
Yeah.
if it's open-ended, it may give the impression that we can do certain things legally, which we had a horrific time in changing federal regulations to allow a veterinarian to carry controlled substances. So I don't think we can be vague about this.
Yeah, Dr. Sullivan, I would agree with you. That is an issue. Most certainly, the controlled substances are better for the purpose of rescuing and calming an animal, but most certainly there are other non-controlled substances that could be used that would accomplish the same purpose.
Other comments from the committee? Public comments?
Speaking from an animal shelter perspective and a rescue perspective, this is very important for access to care for our communities. As Dr. Druce has pointed out, most of these people don't have a veterinarian to go to, and in the instance that it's a stray animal and we can't find an owner, it's really imperative for the safety of the animal and the safety of our officers and staff involved to be able to have access to good sedatives and tranquilizers that will work effectively in the field.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, everyone, and Happy New Year to you all. My name is Eric Mills. I'm Coordinator of Action for Animals in Oakland, and I'm in strong support of this. I think it's a major step in the right direction. I've been working on rodeo animal welfare issues for about 35 years now, rodeos and chariatas. As you know, California has the best rodeo law in the country, I think. It was carried for me by Don Parada back in 1999. And part of that law requires that injury reports be submitted to the State Veterinary Medical Board within 48 hours of the end of the rodeo. Now, according to the reports I've seen, in the first 15 years, there were a total of 43 injury reports submitted to the board. You'd better look for a star in the east. It's a miracle. There's no way in hell that that could be the truth. We have about 90 sanctioned rodeos in California, probably double that number of amateur events. And one of my charo friends tells me there are approximately 800 chariatas held in California every year, in which they're still doing horse stripping, front and rear leg. Even though foreleg is illegal, it's still going on. And the Pialis event and steer tailing. Of those 43 events, one came from a chariata. Again, not possible. When that bill was introduced, the language was to require a veterinarian on site at every rodeo in California. Well, the PRCA, Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association, and their cronies at the Farm Bureau and Cattlemen's Association saw fit to have the bill weakened to allow either an on-call or on-site vet or an on-call vet able to arrive within 1 hour. You think they would allow a cowboy to lie there for an hour waiting for a vet? Somebody with a broken back, say? Not going to happen. All rodeos require ambulances and paramedics. The PRCA in 1995 finally began requiring vets at all of their sanctioned events after 5 animals were killed at Salinas that year. I was present. So for them to oppose an on-site veterinary requirement, I thought was a height of hypocrisy. If you really care about the animals, vets are required on-site at equestrian events, horse racetracks, endurance rides, horse shows. Seems the very least to me that a veterinarian should be on site to take care of injured animals. Now that's why I'm now trying to get that state law amended so as to require either a veterinarian on site or an RVT on site with an on-call veterinarian at hand as well. RVTs work for a lot cheaper than the vets do. It would really broaden the pool of folks available to help these animals. Quite often, rodeo events, injuries are emergency situations. I've seen broken backs, broken necks, broken legs, heart attacks, severe bleeding. An RVT could help stop that. Just between you and me, I think all rodeos should be abolished across the board. They're all inherently humane, and all of these animals are going to be eaten anyway. It's just a detour into the slaughterhouse. So at the very least, it seems to me these animals deserve veterinary care. So I'm in strong support for this. I thank you for taking it on and specifically pointing out what RVTs could be doing to help animals in the rodeos. That said, I thank you for your time. and how this goes forward. Thank you much.
Other public comments?
Doctor?
That would be cool.
Sure, you say that now. Given what the erudite Dr. Sullivan has said, would it be, is there a suggestion that we further refine drug or drugs to include the non-controlled substances so that we don't run afoul of the federal act? I know that would probably limit, maybe limit the utility of this, but it would be difficult for us, in my mind, to successfully promulgate a regulation in conflict with federal law. I know that, like I said, it may diminish the utility of something like this, but it may essentially, if we get the regulation through, perhaps, and we don't demonstrate, anarchy in the streets, perhaps the legislature may fully consider or giving us a bit more coverage. So I'm just curious, is there any thought to further refining this a little bit?
I guess I'm curious as to why we might feel that's necessary. I mean, if it says that somebody, RVT, can give a drug for pain relief, and yet there's a federal rule that says that they cannot give a controlled drug or a specific drug, then I feel like the language is already clear. They cannot give that drug, and just because I said, oh, it's okay for you to RVT to go give that, doesn't make it, it's still a violation of federal law. That would be my interpretation of it. I mean, I understand what Dick's saying, but I think that the law is clear about where the boundaries are, and this, just because we're saying can give medication, can give a drug, doesn't mean we've said it's okay to give any and all. Yes.
Well, we may just add something to the effect in compliance with state and federal law. Because that's enough.
At least that, I agree.
Okay. In compliance.
Right.
Okay. Yes. Please, Eric.
Hi, Erica Hughes, State Humane Association of California. And I'm wondering if it would make sense to proceed with this for RVTs in the same way that we have for animal control officers and humane officers. We, as you know, we added a provision in Penal Code 597.1 that specifically says that animal control and humane officers could administer controlled substances in the field, provided that certain requirements have been met. And so perhaps it makes sense to do it the same way with RVTs, rather than and actually, now that I think about it, in the situation in which an animal control officer or humane officer does need to be called into the rodeo to help, perhaps it makes sense to maybe expand that for animal control officers and humane officers as well, and then maybe just add RVTs into 597.1 or do something along those lines. My concern is that if they don't have access to controlled substances, that they may not have receive adequate care and relief from their pain and their injury.
So I think we need clarification. Access is different than portability. I think we're talking about portability here. So it's not to say that the rodeo could not have controlled substances on site from the veterinarian who's kind of hired by the rodeo to manage that. I don't know how realistic that is. But really what the federal prohibition is for RVTs to carry controlled substances. It's a portability issue, not an access issue. It would work to add it to the penal code, but then we're relying on legislation and finding an author and that not raising hackles for adding yet another support category to, carrying controlled substances. I think you could accomplish the same thing by regulation unless what we hear is that the non-controlled substances will not be effective. If that is in fact the case, then we should definitely look at the legislative route. And that's really for the experts to decide.
Yes.
The discussion about the difference between sedation and anesthesia notwithstanding, this is a very interesting twist to my contention that the cause and effect is the same whether an animal control officer darts an animal in the field, a dog, or whether a RVT provides the same drug at the same dose to perhaps even the same animal in order to clip it because it's so matted. The perverse of all this would be, well, since the animal control officers can carry Telazol with them, so we'll send the RVT out with the animal control officer, who then has less training than the RVT, is, with all due respect to the animal control officers, I'm talking in the abstract here, certainly less experienced than the RVT in administering these drugs, and send a lesser person out to do the same thing that an RVT is more than qualified to do. That makes no sense at all.
Dr. Klingford?
Yes, Diana.
Without knowing anything about this, I'm confident that the California Horse Racing Board has very strict requirements as to racetrack veterinarians and their scope of duties. But I'm just going to point out that other sporting event in the last clause would probably encompass horse racing as well.
They're
No.
regulated by a completely different board.
Yes, that's true, but reading other sporting event might connote to the reader that that includes horse racing, so maybe that should be clarified that it does exclude it.
But that's a possibility. Obviously there's other sporting events besides horse racing. There's dog shows and what have you. But yes, there are very specific guidelines for what can happen on the track and how the veterinary care is handled for track veterinarians. In fact, there's a state veterinarian who's employed by the state to oversee the medicine that happens at the track, so it is very specific. We don't exempt horse racing or track protocol from any of the other laws, so it would seem odd that we do it here. I think it's kind of a known.
I'm just pointing up that other sporting event adds that element of inquiry, shall we say. I'm just pointing it up, and I am aware about the horse racing board and their feelings about animal care and racetrack competence.
So we've got, great discussion. We do have language here. That's been proposed. There has been some discussion about 597.1A2 in the penal code. However, if you keep going down that particular penal code, there's also subsets of what that animal control officer needs to have, and includes firearms training and things of this sort. So it's not a neat fit to just kind of toss RVT into that. I would agree that much of that language is good and about administering a tranquilizer that contains a controlled substance for the health and safety of a wild, stray, or abandoned animal, or the health and safety of others. There's some good stuff there, but it's not an easy fit. It is not entirely beyond this group to have that discussion, but it is a separate discussion in its own way. And so I think we should come back to the issue that's in front of us and see if we can move forward with that. And if we feel that we need to have or expand this 597.1, I would actually go back to SHAC and that working group and say, because that's an RVT job task question now, that perhaps that would be a good place for that to come back and forward to us again. Okay, I don't want to lose it. It's good, but I just don't know that this is the right place for it just now. David?
I have one other suggestion. You're correct about the penal code on the 597. It's just too complicated. But I would throw out the idea that, and again, this would hinge upon legal counsel, which, hello, just as a suggestion, and under 4840, which is our section, where RVTs are allowed to purchase controlled substances for the purpose of euthanasia, federal government, because of state regulation, considers those people mid-level practitioners. And you will see that the category of mid-level practitioner in other states allows you to handle other types of substances. And so there could be a workaround in that category, in the mid-level practitioner level, that there could be language that not necessarily allows you to purchase it, but allows you to use that substance for a specific purpose.
Thank you. I think there's essentially two issues. I think Dr. Klingborg has talked about one of them, and that when we talk about going outside of into statute, we sort of leap beyond the boundaries of this agenda item. So I think the issue here for me as legal counsel is, what do you want to do with this? And if it's, you want me to, go take a further look at it or whatever, make sure it's consistent or whatever, and talk about sporting events and stuff, I can certainly do that and bring it back to the MDC for the next time. If this body wants to talk about amendments to the penal code or its own business professions code, I would respectfully suggest we table that until we get to the next agenda items or future agenda items, and then we can put that on for the next discussion, or we can kind of go backwards and say we've had some conversations about it. Maybe we'll include that in the greater scope of things that RVTs and others can or can't do. But to entertain discussions about 597 of the Penal Code and 4840 under this narrow agenda item, in my opinion, isn't appropriate.
So we've got language in front of us. Do we want to move forward with this language? Any other discussion either from the public or the committee? All are welcome. Yes.
Have we amended this to add the federal?
We did amend and say administration of a drug or drugs in compliance with state and federal laws to maintain, etc.
Okay.
Okay. Are
you ready for a motion?
I would love a motion, yes.
I move that we adopt 2069, or recommend to the board that we move forward with 2069, I guess it's item 9 as amended.
I'll second.
Okay, got a motion and a second. Any discussion from the committee? Discussion from the public? Call for the vote.
I got it. Okay. Dr. Klingborg.
Aye.
Dr. Drusis.
Aye.
Dr. Grant.
Aye.
Dr. Pollard.
Aye.
Dave Johnson.
Aye.
Christy Pulowski.
Aye.
Diana Woodward-Hagel.
Aye.
Jennifer Laredo.
Aye.
And Dr. Sullivan.
Aye.
Motion carries. We are going to, thank you. We are now going to break for a 1-hour lunch, and we will start at 1:30 sharp. See you then.